Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec. I'm Dr. George Vergolias, executive and resilience coach, forensic psychologist, and your guide for this 4-part series on separation and divorce. Today is episode number 14 of the podcast, and it's part 4 of our series, The Beginner's Guide to Navigating Separation and Divorce. So far, we've explored how to recognize when it's time to let go, how to separate with grace, not chaos, and how to build your identity and self-worth and rebuild it specifically after separation or divorce. Today, we're going to close the loop with one of the most important and often complex pieces of that puzzle, which is how to co-parent after separation, how to manage conflict, and how to create a new sustainable normal, which really is about re-identifying yourself. Let's get into it. For the first part today, what I really want to focus on is our perception of the goal, because the goal isn't perfection. So often in this growth-oriented world that we live on, if you go on social media, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it may be, you're constantly seeing influencers, and frankly, even me, talking about a growth mindset, talking about improving your life, talking about getting better. And what we're always seeing is the constant highlight reel of everyone's life. And yet we're living this kind of shit show be-real behind the scenes, which is messy and ugly. And it's real easy for that to give us the impression that the goal is perfection. And the goal is not perfection. The goal is progress and stability. Because co-parenting isn't about achieving some idealized version of modern family life. It's about minimizing harm and maximizing stability for you and your children. So it's important that we let go of the pressure to agree on everything. We're not going to agree on everything. There's a reason you separated. There's a reason you divorced. It's unlikely you're going to agree on everything. I separated and then divorced this past year from my ex after 17 years. We have one of the most amicable relationships I know. We genuinely care about each other. We respect each other. We just came to a place that we realized we just weren't right for each other anymore. In fact, when we signed our separation and divorce papers in front of a notary, the notary was joking with us, saying he signs hundreds of these and he's never seen a couple come in together to sign it and be laughing with each other. And we were. So I have a really good example. I'm walking the walk of how you can minimize harm and maximize stability. And the way that we have done it, and we continue to do it, my ex and I, is we focus instead on creating a foundation of consistency. And what that means is 3 core factors. One is predictable routines, respectful, if not warm communication. So the communication isn't always fuzzy, but it's at least respectful. And then minimizing exposure to conflict. And we're going to talk further about that throughout the next 30 minutes or so. It's important to realize and remember that children don't need parents who are best friends. They need parents who create a container of emotional safety, even while navigating their own pain and their own growth and their own rebound. The most reliable predictor of a child's well-being post-divorce? Any guesses? It's low parental conflict. It's not wealth. It's not a custody schedule. It's low parental conflict. And I would say the very close second is when the child or the children realize that both mom and dad are going to be okay, that they're starting to rebound. They're starting to create their new life. It doesn't mean you have somebody in your life. You're just starting to rebound and get your feet under you. And it's the sense that mom and dad will be okay, and therefore we will be okay. Divorce in and of itself, while yes, divorce can be very difficult and in some cases damaging for children. I'm not going to say no to that. The evidence is fairly consistent. But when you look at the evidence in more specificity, what you find is divorce per se is not what is so damaging to kids. It is divorcing badly. It is divorcing with high conflict. Many kids that come through divorce in amicable, respectful, and structured ways actually go on to be just fine. They go on to thrive. It doesn't mean they don't have a period of adjustment. We all do. But that is not the damaging legacy. So keep that front and center as we continue to navigate forward. The other thing that I think it's important to make a distinction of when we're talking about this co-parenting space is the difference between co-parenting versus parallel parenting. And a lot of people that I coach and I work with about 2/3 to 3/4 men and the remainder women. And many of them, not all, but many of them work with me to navigate relationships and navigate separation and divorce and kind of find the new them, find their new identity. And many don't understand this distinction. But it's important to realize that not every post-divorce parenting relationship is collaborative. And again, that's okay. You have to work with what you have. You may be completely amicable and collaborative, and your ex just isn't all that willing to work with you. That's still a deck of cards or a hand of cards that you need to deal with, right? So co-parenting works best when both parents are emotionally stable and able to prioritize the child over ego or conflict. Parallel parenting is for high conflict or emotionally volatile situations where minimal interaction protects both the child and the parent from unnecessary drama. So, for example, if your ex is narcissistic, if they are controlling, if they are abusive, emotionally, physically, in any way, or if they're just chronically disrespectful because of seething, unresolved anger, you are not obligated to work as a team. Parallel parenting gives you emotional distance while still fulfilling your parenting duties. So it is a respectful understanding that while they're at the ex's home, they have their rules under their roof. And provided that those are safe and not abusive to the children, I have to give some emotional distance and allowance for that. And then when the kid is back with me, I've got my rules. And I realize that if those rules are markedly different, that can create disconnect and it can create mixed messages for the kids. And that's where some of that collaboration needs to come in to the degree that you can work with it. In some cases, you may not be able to. So it's important at the outset to get an understanding of, do I truly have a collaborative, open, amicable co-parenting relationship? Am I in one of those unfortunate situations where I'm really in a parallel parenting situation because my ex is just not willing to engage? And frankly, some of you listening, you might be that ex. You might be the one that has seething anger and you're inflexible. And if this at all is hitting a nerve, maybe it's time to look in the mirror and do some work yourself to try to identify what are those things. And again, coaching can certainly help with that. And in some cases, if you have past diagnoses or mental health issues, then maybe therapy would be the answer for that. But the distinction between co-parenting versus parallel parenting is a important one to keep in mind. And it's important that you choose the model that protects your peace and protects your child's development for what they need at the age that they're at. So related to this, let's say you are in a relationship with your ex that is co-parenting, or maybe you fall under parallel parenting. Communication is key. So, what are some recommendations that I have here for communicating with your ex? And I've got some scripts and some tools for you to take away today that you can employ and think about. And this is where most post-divorce partnerships rise or fall, is in the communication. Because when the communication starts going south, it is so easy for emotionally charged feelings and old resentments and old issues to come rushing in, and it colors the whole exchange. And before you know it, you're in the middle of a shouting match. So one of the best methods that I ever saw is one that was developed by Bill Eddy, Eddy, Bill Eddy. And he calls it the B.I.F.F method, B-I-F-F. And I think this is golden. B.I.F.F stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm. So brief, stick to the facts, not feelings. The interactions with your ex should not be about feelings. That's for coaching, or that's for your therapy, or that's for venting with your friends when you're out having champagne brunch or at dinner or at the ball game, right? Brief, stick to the facts of what needs to happen or what did happen, not feelings. Second, informative, share necessary information only. Don't get into all kinds of ancillary sharing of information. That gives your ex, especially if they're toxic or prone to narcissistic, controlling, abusive, toxic behavior, that gives them additional things to pick at. It gives them additional ammunition. So be informative, which means you share only the critical information that you need to share. Think of it as a need to know basis, right? Friendly, use a neutral tone. This can be very tough because what we find from the research and from the work I do as a coach and as a therapist, what we find is even when people think they're using a neutral tone, often they're not, because they're filtering it through their own filter. And they are actually maybe being nicer than they would like to be, but that still doesn't mean you're using a neutral tone. You still could be using a tone that conveys conflict or that could have kind of a gaslighting feel to it. So what I often recommend to my clients is if you know you're having an interaction coming up, record it in the mirror at home first, or write it out and then read it back. And then imagine you are in the shoes of that other person, your ex, and how would you hear that? Do you hear it as a neutral tone, or does it seem more biting or accusatory? And if it feels like the latter, rewrite it and re-practice the delivery. That's how you help maintain a neutral tone. And then fourth, firm. Set clear expectations and clear boundaries. I've talked about boundaries recently in a prior podcast episode. So it's very important that you set clear expectations of what you need and what you want, and clear boundaries. So B.I.F.F, brief, informative, friendly, and firm. Let me give you some examples. Instead of saying something like, you never listen and always screw up the schedule. Think about that statement. It's not very neutral. In a way, you might be factual, but there's an implication of feelings in there. And there's an accusation in there, right? That is more inflammatory. And you're not necessarily sharing just the key information, right? You're going beyond that. So instead of saying you never listen and always screw up the schedule, consider saying this: just confirming that we agreed to switch weekends for next month. Let me know if that's changed. Notice the difference. You know in your head that they don't listen. You might know in your head that they always screw up the schedule. That's not the point. The point is to use the B.I.F.F method to confirm what the expectations are and then check in with them with a neutral tone. Something to think about here, and I told this story many years ago, but I was at my wedding day and my Uncle Joel came in. I got married in North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and my Uncle Joel flew in. Many people flew in, but my Uncle Joel flew in from Chicago, and he was just a great, funny guy, hardworking, blue collar dude, chain smoker, had a really deep voice like this. And I found myself right after the reception standing kind of off to the side, and everyone, of course, was gravitating towards the bride, which is what you do. I was having a whiskey, and he came over and gave me a little cheers. And I said, "Hey, Uncle Joel, you've been married 35, 40 years. Any advice?" And he said, "In marriage, 90% of the time, you can choose to be right or you can choose to be happy." And we had a good chuckle. And I do find that that is true in a lot of relationships, by the way. But in this example, kind of bring it back to what we're talking about today. When it comes to communicating with your ex around co-parenting, much of the time you can choose to be right or you can choose to be effective. So when you say something like you never listen and always screw up the schedule, you might be totally right about that. You might be 100% correct. The question is, how does that serve you? Does that get you the outcome you want? And I'm guessing the outcome you want is for your ex to collaborate with you on the schedule so you guys can have clarity and no mix ups. So saying it the way I just said it, again, you can be right, but it's not going to be very effective. Whereas saying the follow up that I replaced it with, just confirming we agreed to switch weekends for next month, let me know if that's changed. That is an effective way of communicating that helps move the ball in the right direction. I'm surprised how many separated and divorced couples don't realize that there is some technology advancements that you can use to your advantage. Applications like Our Family Wizard, Talking Parents, or Cozy, COZI. These are apps that allow scheduling, they allow sharing of schedule changes. In some cases, they have a tone neutralizer. So you can actually put your what you want to say into the app and it will give you feedback on how it sounds. It uses AI to give you some scripts to maybe reword some of the tonnage of what you want to say. These are very useful. You can also set email filters for co-parent messages. So if you have an ex that tends to trigger you, which then elicits a fast and rapid and somewhat inflammatory or angry response, set email filters so that you could have those come out of your inbox, go into a special folder, and then you only check that folder a couple times a day when you're in the right headspace to do so. That's just one other technique you can do. And then you can avoid text threads during emotionally charged moments. You can silent text threads or just have the discipline to say, I'm not going to look at that text today. Or I'm not going to look at that text for the next couple hours. I just had a big heated argument with my ex. I'm going to go for a run or I'm going to meditate or do yoga and I'm just going to unwind and I'm not going to check the text for at least 2 hours until I calm down. All of these are different ways that you can kind of adjust or tweak the systemic structure to your advantage. And so much of it, remember, comes down to you. It comes down to how you want to handle these things and the choices that you're making. And remember that not every message deserves a response. Silence is sometimes the most strategic choice. Just because they throw something at you that's incendiary, it doesn't mean you have to catch it. If someone throws a hand grenade, there's no rule that says you have to catch it. You can just jump out of the way, run away from it, right? For a period of time. So again, these are just little ways. Now, none of these things are going to make your toxic ex suddenly be really amicable or friendly or collaborative. But remember, in this section, we are talking about how you are managing your reactivity and the best way to do that so that you can be effective, not so you can prove that you're right. All right. So part of the equation in all of this that we're talking about and with communication and navigating conflict with your ex is how do you protect the kids from emotional collateral damage? And that's a tough one. And it's a tough one if you have an ex that isn't all that willing to cooperate. Now, what I always like to do, and again, I have a very harsh, it's not harsh. I have a very direct, some may think it's harsh, way of coaching where I always start by confronting my clients first on what can you do differently. Then we will figure out how do we shape the other person because we can control your behavior 100%, meaning you can control your behavior 100%. We can't always control what other people do. When I'm talking about protecting your kids from collateral damage, I always open with what are you doing to either exacerbate the conflict or maybe to at least not reduce the conflict? What steps can you do? And there are some hard truths many parents don't want to hear about this topic. One is your children hear more than you think. They're picking up more than you think. One thing that I think a lot of parents that don't work in the psychology or social work or developmental or healthcare fields don't realize is when you are a young child, a toddler, and then when you're in the latency ages from 3 or 4 on to 6, 7, 8, and even in the preteen phases up to 12, 13, 14, much of your world is still very much controlled and organized by the adults in your life. And when you're really young, and you really don't have either the verbal ability to express yourself, or maybe you could speak. You're 5 years old, but you don't have a wealth of ability to express nuance around feelings and thoughts related to your parents and how they're arguing and the conflict that you're observing. All you have is your powers of observation, right? You have to read the room very carefully when you are not in control of the room. And that's why kids are very good at picking up on subtle emotional interactions. So your children hear more than you think. Your tone is louder than your words. I talked in a prior podcast, I think it was last week, about how the majority of communication is your nonverbals. About 60 to 70% is your nonverbals, is what is communicated. Then another 20 to 30% is your tone. And the last remaining 10% or so are the actual words and content of the communication itself. So your tone is louder than your words, and it says more than your words. And people chronically underestimate the harshness of their tone. It's so important to be aware of not only what you think your tone is, but the likelihood of how someone else is going to hear it. And third, your behavior teaches them how to love and be loved. I think this one is so profound. I often hear from people that are navigating these choices. Well, I don't want to divorce. I'm miserable. We've been miserable for years. We fight all the time, but I don't want to divorce, or we're staying together for the kids. And I understand that inclination. I'll be frank. In some ways, I did that for a number of years. But staying together for the kids, you're actually modeling year after year after year an image, a model of how to be loved and how to love. And so the question I often say to my clients is, if your daughter or your son was now 25 or 35, and in the same kind of relationship that you're observing the same dynamics, would you tell them to stay, or would you recommend that they leave? So kids pick up a lot, and it's important to realize that. So you first have to come to awareness of those hard truths, that they hear more than you think, your tone is louder than your words, and your behavior teaches them how to love and how to be loved. So some things to avoid: venting about the other parent in front of your child. This is going to be hard at times. I've made this mistakes, right? I have a podcast. I give keynote speeches around the country and even around the world on managing conflict. I am a certified workplace violence mitigation expert. And even I struggle with this because I'm human. I've become much better at it, but early on, yeah, I struggled with this at times. Even at one point, my teenage daughter had to say, "Dad, I don't want to hear this. I don't want you venting about mom." She had to properly put me in my place. And that was an eye opener for me. The other is avoid asking them to relay messages. They are not your message service. They are not your emotional carrier pigeon. Don't do that. And third, avoid making them choose sides, even subtly. There's a lot of ways that we can do this in a really subtle manner, and we have to be very cautious. Often it can come off as passive aggressive statements. So instead of doing those things, give your child a consistent narrative. Something like this: we both love you, and we're working together in our own ways. Or we both love you, and although it is difficult for us, and there's times that we get into conflicts, we are trying to curb that. By the way, if they're a bit older, think of this, and we're working on it as best we can. Also, validate their confusion or sadness without placing blame. It's understandable that you feel this way. Many people that go through this, or many kids that go through this, feel this way. Notice there's no blame. You're not blaming your ex. You're not blaming yourself. You're not blaming the kids. And then reassure them that the divorce is not their fault. So many kids, even if they say it out loud that they know it's not their fault, emotionally, they might still have that feeling. So these are good messages that you can provide to the kids. Now, when your kids are very, very young, meaning like I would say under the age of 6, 7, in some cases even 8. That last message might be a little difficult in terms of they don't really have the processing ability. Some do, some don't. If they're under 5, I wouldn't get into all of that. It's just a matter of conveying that they are loved and that you are providing a stable home. Remember, children are emotional sponges. If they sense hostility, they will internalize it as their fault. And so that's why we want to avoid some of the things we just discussed and replace them with some of those other things that we just reviewed. Therapy for your kids is not an overreaction, it is prevention. And doing some of the things we just talked about is the same. It is a prevention or a preventive aspect of trying to care about their well being. So let's say you have a high conflict ex, you have that narcissist, you have that grievance collector, is sometimes what I call. I mean, it's somebody that never lets a grievance go and just harbors complaints all the time, right? Maybe they were even abusive and certainly controlling. How do you manage that? Some relationships don't end when the papers are signed. That's the hard truth. If you're tied to a high conflict ex, here's your survival guide. And I have 5 recommendations. This is not an exhaustive list, but here's some 5 things to at least to begin to think about. Number 1, document everything. Keep a log of interactions, especially around scheduling and agreements. Also, screenshot abusive or threatening messages and save those in a folder. That's really important to do that. You never know if you'll need it. So just save it. The reverse is terrible. Eventually, you might need that and you haven't saved it. So document everything. Number 2, stick to written communication. Avoid in-person or phone conversations unless absolutely necessary. Written communication does 2 things. You can convey tone through written words. Of course you can, but it's so much easier to lose control of tone in an actual conversation because we get heated, we get emotional, and it comes through so quickly in the tone and the cadence and the pitch of our voice. So if you stick to written communication, you limit a lot of the problems that tone or tonality bring into it. Number 3, have a court-backed parenting plan. Whether you go through mediation, whether you go through an amicable agreed upon divorce, or whether it's hostile and you both lawyered up, having a court-backed parenting plan offers specifics around roles and expectations. Vagueness invites manipulation. Okay. Vagueness loves a vacuum. When there's a vacuum and there's a lack of clarity, vagueness loves to come in as well as manipulation. So be specific. Also, use court orders to clarify holidays, handoffs, and decision-making rights, especially if those are points of conflict. Court orders and working those things out, again, either through mediation or if you lawyer up through working with your lawyer, that could set the rules of engagement. And then if they're not honoring that, now you actually have some ammunition. And the ammunition isn't to get revenge. The ammunition is there to get clarity and consistency. That's the goal. Number 4, don't emotionally engage. Their chaos doesn't need to become your crisis. Just because they are not emotionally regulated doesn't mean that you have to jump in to the cesspool of their emotional regulation. You don't have to. It doesn't have to happen, right? Rehearse non-reactive phrases. Things like, I'll respond when I've had time to review that. And why do I say rehearse that? Because like anything, these are habits. This is a communication muscle that if you don't use it, you're not going to use it in the heat of the moment when someone's yelling at you or you're feeling triggered or you're feeling excitable, meaning emotionally, right? Agitated. So rehearse it. Rehearse it in front of the mirror. Rehearse it with a loved one who you trust. Role play it so that when the time comes and this person is trying to trigger your buttons or push your buttons, you are able to go to those script statements like, I'll respond when I've had time to review that. And then you cut them off and you take the time you need. Number 5, build a conflict resilient support system. You're going to need your supports that are outside the relationship, of course, your ex relationship, whether that's a therapist. In some cases, it might be your attorney. Certainly, a big chunk of my coaching practice is filled with people that are navigating at different phases this process. So certainly a life or executive coach can be helpful here. Friends who don't fan the flames. And that's really important. You need friends who can be objective, who could talk to you straight with no bullshit, and also don't throw gasoline on the flames or the drama fire that's already going on. And you know who those friends are. You know who those friends are. They might be really helpful, those friends, when you really just want to vent and you want to go down the vent vacuum or the vent, rabbit hole, but they do not often offer clarity. So you need those objective, more neutral friends that can give you good judgment and help you with decision making. And remember, your goal isn't to win. This isn't a zero-sum game. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, and I'm going to go back to my Uncle Joel. You can choose to be right, or you can choose to be effective. The goal isn't about winning and being right. The goal is to protect your sanity, create peace, and protect your children's security. That's the goal. So those are just some high-level tips for managing your exes or high conflict exes. Next, for some of you, and actually, I'm going to say I hope for all of you, and for some of you, you can't even imagine what I'm about to say, but I'm hoping at some point you guys come to the other side of this thing and you start creating a new normal or a next normal, and even start thinking about loving again and relationships again. And with that, I kind of think of it, again, I use this metaphor a lot, but I think of it like a caterpillar going into a cocoon. When you first enter that phase, that phase of I'm going to redefine myself, it is exciting. When you're crawling into the cocoon, it seems exciting because you're all focused on becoming that butterfly on the back end. And now you have wings and now you can take flight and you're beautiful and all these things. But there's a process that once you get into that cocoon, the excitement wears off. Why? Because the cocoon sucks. It's super warm in there. It's humid. It's sweaty. It's filled with mucus. It smells. The cocoon sometimes is not a comfortable place to be as you're going through that metamorphosis, as you are transforming. The key is to remember you are transforming and you are transforming towards something that's going to come out on the other end. And that is critical. And that is so important. So at some point, you may begin dating again or getting into relationships again, whether it's willfully or you just find suddenly you caught feelings for someone. But let me be clear on all of this. Dating itself is not a recovery strategy. It's a reward for doing your inner work. So dating is not the strategy to get over it. Dating and being open to the next relationship is about a signaling that I've done the inner work and I'm now ready to have an authentic, healthy relationship with somebody else. So how do you know you're ready? Well, there's some questions to ask yourself. And I've talked about this in a recent podcast as well. But some questions to think about is, am I clear on what I want in a relationship now? And underlining that question is, what have I learned? How have I grown? How am I different? Right? Have I forgiven myself and my ex? And by the way, forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. I'll say that again. Forgiving does not mean forgetting. We could still remember what our ex did to us. We can still have a lot of feelings about that, and we can own those feelings. Forgiving is a choice. It's not a feeling. It's not you wake up one day and there's no more animosity or anger or frustration towards your ex, and suddenly you have now forgiven them. Forgiving is a choice, but the feelings can still come and go. Also, I can forgive someone and still choose to keep them out of my life or minimize interactions in my life. Forgiving doesn't mean you have to be fully back in my life either, right? But that's the second question. Have I forgiven myself for any things I've done, any mistakes I've made? And have I also forgiven my ex? If I am still seething with animosity and anger and jadedness, I'm probably not ready to step into that next authentic relationship. And third, am I secure enough to be alone? This question I love. Am I secure enough to be alone? Another way to think about this question is my peace more important than needing to be in a relationship? Let me say that again. Is my peace more important than needing to be in a relationship? once I got to a place that my own peace and my own security was enough, and I was fine being alone, then I was ready to actually explore wanting to be in a relationship. I didn't need to be in a relationship, but I wanted at one point to be in a relationship. And then I was able to bring my authentic self to that. And then I found someone, and we've been going strong for several years. So those are key questions to ask yourself as you are establishing that next normal. For your kids, there are some other questions that you want to ask in regard to your kids. Things to think about is not introducing new partners too early. You want to be careful about mixed messages. Keep in mind that your kids are definitely processing things, whether they are talking about them or not, they are working shit out internally. So you want to be cautious about bringing someone else new into the mix too early. There's a lot of ways to handle that. If you're engaged in therapy or they're engaged in therapy, talk to your therapist. If you're in coaching, work through some of this with your coach. If you're not in either, make sure that they're at a stage where the kids are getting back into some normalcy, some normal routines. They're smiling again, they're laughing again, right? And then very, very subtly or gradually introduce that new partner into their life so they can acclimate to that adjustment over time. Another thing for the kids is give your children space to process. They're going to need time, they're going to need space. You as an adult may want to talk. You may want to rush in every night. Tell me how you're doing. How are you doing with the divorce? What's going on? What are you feeling? Give them some space. Be present when they come with questions, but allow them to create the space that they need. And don't pressure them to bond quickly. That's one of the worst things you can do is try to pressure them to like or bond or connect with somebody that you like or your new partner. That needs to happen over time. Now, the flip side, I will say, is as adults, there is a point where you might say, I have this partner, we've been together for quite a while, maybe months, maybe even a year or longer, and the kids are still not coming around. There is a time in which you might, especially if you're dealing with teenagers, where you have to have the difficult discussion of saying, I have a right to fall in love again. I have a right to find somebody or find my next person. Now, if they have a legitimate gripe, your kids, meaning they're abusive, they're angry, they're not engaging with the kids, there's then that's something that might need to be worked out in the course of the relationship. Or maybe the partner isn't a good fit for being around your kids. Maybe they don't like kids. Maybe they're not open to dating somebody with kids and they're not truly acknowledging that or holding accountability for that. There's a lot of nuances to that. But at some point in my own particular relationship with my current partner, she and I had to just acknowledge that the kids were not warming up as quickly as we liked. And so we were just very honest about after like a year and a half together, we are going to start going to dinners. We're going to start doing some things. The kids came along, meaning they adjusted eventually, right? So there is a balance to be had here in that giving them space, but over time, reintroducing the partner. Because again, you as the adult, you have a right to be happy again. You have a right to have somebody in your life again, provided they're a good fit for you and a good fit for the kids. The other part here is reclaim your solo identity. That's so important. Build a life where you are the main character. So many of us over many years have given up this sense of us as a main character because we've given up so much for the marriage. And maybe we have subjugated important parts of ourselves to the person we were with. Maybe sometimes out of default, maybe because they were controlling. A lot of different reasons we may have done this. But guess what? Now there is a new book and it's got blank pages and you can rewrite who you want to be as that main character. Also, rediscover your goals, passions, and values. Look into things that you gave up years ago because your ex didn't want you to do that. Your ex didn't want you to sing in the choir. Your ex didn't want you to work that part-time job. Your ex didn't want you to start that home business. Now it's time to redefine all that and rethink what do you want to be? Because we're all growing up. Until the day we die, we're all growing up. I'm 56 years old and I'm still in part trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And I encourage you to do the same. This next chapter of your life is authored by you. It's not by the pain of your past. That's the key to take away here. All right. We've been going for about 40 minutes. Let's kind of close this up. Here's what I want you to remember. You can be a phenomenal parent even if your relationship ended. You can protect your children even if your ex refuses to evolve. You're not helpless, you're not hopeless here. You can create emotional safety without control. Divorce is not a failure, it is a transition, it is a metamorphosis. And the beautiful part of it, you control that transformation for you. It may be messy, just like the cocoon metaphor I talked about, and it may be unfair at times, but it can still be meaningful and it can still be transformational. You're not just managing fallout, you're actually building a legacy of resilience, emotional intelligence, and conscious parenting. All right. Thank you for joining me for this 4-part series. If you found value in these episodes, consider sharing them. I would be so grateful for that. And share them with someone navigating the same path. Hopefully it's helpful to them. Remember, insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn awareness into movement and stress into strategy, coaching can be the catalyst. Coaching will change you. Reach out to set up a free consultation. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Let's create real momentum starting now. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias, The Unstressed Exec. Thanks for listening. See you next time. And remember, shift happens.